Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be continuing the Big Four series, looking at the countries that receive the most startup funding in Africa. So I'm sure you guys know the drill by now. I'm going to kick off with a quick overview, and then we're going to look at the investment landscape, looking at the strengths and then the issues of Egypt. And then we're going to look at the capital markets, looking at the public market, the private markets, and then I'm going to provide my take on the future outlook of Egypt. So I think from a quick overview perspective, Egypt, as of January the 1st, 2022, has a population of 102.88 million people. The majority of the population was between 0 and 4 years, adding to roughly 14 million children. A good thing, and kind of like highlights the African continent in general, is that the population of Egypt is skewed towards the younger generations, and I think the elderly aged 75 years and older only amounted to 1 million people. So once again, we've got this theme of a growing, very young nation that obviously in the next few decades is going to participate a lot more in the global economy. So just throwing the graph up on the screen for everyone's reference, since 1952, the Egyptian population has doubled twice. Once in 1980 and once again in 2012, where it reached almost 86.5 million. Of course, I said earlier that it's now 102 million or 102.88 million. Among the reasons why this growth has taken place is that in terms of linked to the increasing population is better health services provided for most Egyptians since the establishment of the Egyptian Republic. In more recent years, over the last few years, the population growth in the country has actually increased compared to previous years, up until about 2013, where it reached 2.27% before decreasing yearly, where it has been now. There are many handicaps before democratization in Egypt, which is kind of a function of a lot of the kind of African nations when we look at their history. To be fair, a lot of nations, when we look at their history, the elite stake in the authoritarian rule, widespread political extremism and structural problems within the political culture of the country in terms of the democracy made it very difficult, but eventually democracy did prevail through in the 1970s. Now to look at the strengths, I think it's important for us to kick off from natural resources. So in addition to the agricultural capacity of the Nile Valley and the Delta, Egypt's natural resources include petroleum, natural gas, phosphate, and iron ore. So just kind of like shifting over to petroleum, crude oil is found primarily in the Gulf of Suez and in the Western Desert. Natural gas is found mainly in the Nile Delta, off the Mediterranean seashore and in the Western Desert. Oil and gas accounts for approximately 12% of GDP and export of petroleum and related products. I think a really good thing that the Egyptian government have really been focused on and trying to look at in terms of future-proofing is the focus on LNG as opposed to crude oil. So as we know, kind of like crude oil production in Egypt actually has been on the decline over the last few years. I think from estimates at the time, it was more than 920,000 barrels per day were being produced in about 1995 to less than 662,000 barrels per day as of April 2006. This was a concerted effort to minimize the growing domestic demand of petroleum products, which were currently estimated at the time of about 25 million metric tons per year. So Egypt is actually encouraging the production of natural gas. So over a 5-year period, production of natural gas in the early 2000s, production of natural gas actually increased by approximately 75% to reach about 3.3 billion cubic feet per day by the end of the full year of 2003-2004. And currently now, gas accounts for almost 50% of all hydrocarbon usage in Egypt. And why this is quite important is because with Egypt's excess of natural gas able to meet its domestic demand for many years to come, the Ministry of Petroleum has made it a strategic objective for it to increase its petrochemical industry and also the increase of exporting of natural gas to the wider world, as that is one of its main strategic objectives. And as of September 2005, that was when they kicked off this policy. From then, I think there was about 3 liquefied natural gas trains that were already in motion, that had already been in operation. And that's a super exciting theme. I know that there were other contexts in play, but I think just kind of like looking at the transition from the petroleum over to LNG, liquefied natural gas, provides a nice playbook for a lot of other countries in the region to participate and do also. I think it's also good to mention from a quick overview how the importance of the Nile River to Egypt. So without the Nile River, Egypt would essentially be a desert. And I say this because only about 2.5 centimeters or an inch of rain falls throughout Egypt each year. But obviously, each summer, the river rises because of rains at its source far to the south in Ethiopia, and floods cover the river's valleys, leaving sediments needed for trees, plants, and crops to grow. And I think this is it's also a picture of kind of how major cities, kind of like over the last 1,000 years, have also developed next to or near ports or rivers that have provided the opportunity, as we know, water provided opportunity for travel and commerce to happen. So Egypt is no exception with the presence of the Nile River. Okay, and while we're also looking at the strengths, I think a huge strength, it's kind of noted by the population dynamic, is Egypt's young population. And I think Egypt's population as well is relatively well educated as well, which is always a good thing in terms of kind of like future advancement, applicability to kind of technological and digital revolution, which is really, really important at this stage as well. I feel that's always a major point to state. And it's also a metaphor or wider context of the wider African continent as well, which is doing really well from a youthful perspective. I think it's also important to note that Egypt's youthful population also provides it with an adequate base in which it can build on future developments, especially when I think the literacy rate is 97%, which is a very strong indicator of potential performance and the ability to kind of like upskill and provide them the youthful base with the opportunity to participate in the digital revolution that is taking place, the fourth industrial revolution, some people are calling it. That's another strength that Egypt has, and if the government think very thoughtfully and diligently about how to leverage that population, they can see themselves benefiting from the continuing wave of technological advancement. So there are a few factors or a few issues impacting Egypt that I think would be the most pertinent at this moment in time for the economic landscape. But the first one being the low foreign currency reserves as a result of high interest payments. So a World Bank report was released in July last year, July 2022, and in it indicated that Egypt held foreign debt of nearly $158 billion at the end of March 2022. Egypt had committed to repaying $33 billion over March 2022 to March 2023. But however, the country's foreign reserves were estimated at $33.3 billion. So as you can see, it's becoming quite tight in order to kind of like meet those interest payments. Obviously, the low foreign currency reserve will impact its ability to kind of like manage imports and exports and its relationship with the kind of like global economy in the future, which becomes very difficult when looking at kind of like becoming competitive from a global standpoint. In May 2022, credit rating agency Moody's lowered its future projections for Egypt from stable to negative, and I believe a large result of this was the fact of the interest rate payments and the low foreign currency reserves. Egypt also, so as we mentioned before, Egypt does have a very youthful population, but it also has a shortage, like many other African countries, of skilled and semi-skilled workforce. So while there is an abundance of kind of low-skilled workforce, even if there are kind of like some high-skilled workers available, their training is quite poor. It's still quite poor. And this is mostly a problem in small, medium companies and large public industries that are working protected domestic markets. Kind of like in comparison to kind of like other nations in North Africa, Egypt's average gross production per worker is lower than Morocco and Tunisia. Youth unemployment is very high, primarily due to a lack of education system in providing necessary training under TVET programs. And TVET programs are essentially training and vocational education and training systems, basically. So just training, vocational education and training systems. And there hasn't been much investment from that standpoint from Egypt's government towards that. But from recent adjustments and recent communications from the Ministry of Education in Egypt, this is definitely a strategic objective for them going forward. And finally, the Russia-Ukraine war has had a tremendous impact and a disproportionate impact, if we've been super honest, in terms of the kind of like cascade and the economic landscape of Egypt, especially in comparison to other African nations. So Egypt's engagement with Russia and Ukraine for its food security and tourism has meant that the Egyptian economy has been impacted by the war. So Egypt imports more wheat than any other country, and prior to Russia's invasion, Egypt secured 80% of its wheat imports from both Ukraine and Russia. The recent limited resumption of Ukrainian grain exports has driven wheat prices down. And in addition to this, Russia and Ukraine previously accounted for 30% of Egyptian tourism, but it has been deflated by the conflict and sanctions. And now tourism revenues have decreased to $2.4 billion in the period of January to March 2022, down from almost $3 billion in the same period in the year prior, 2021. So we're seeing that the Russia-Ukraine war also had a disproportionate impact on the Egyptian economy. Okay, cool. So now we're going to look at the capital markets analysis. We're going to start off with the public markets. So looking at the public markets, we can see, just throwing this up on the screen for everyone's reference, we're looking at the largest Egyptian stocks by market capitalization. So the first largest is the Commercial International Bank Egypt, and it is a commercial banking holding company. So it was founded in 1994 and is the largest Egyptian company on the OMX with a market capitalization of 163.5 billion US dollars. And next is ABUK, which is Abu Qir Fertilizers and Chemical Industries Coast SA, and that's a former state-owned company actually that is one of the largest producers of nitrogen fertilizers in Egypt and the Middle East. It produces about 50% of the Egyptian nitrogen fertilizers, and that has a market capitalization of $51.9 billion. And then moving on, we've got the Telecom Egypt company, which together with its subsidiaries provides public communications and related products and services, the WE brand in Egypt. And Etel company was ranked third in Egypt with a value of around $46.7 billion US dollars. Seems interesting. I think if we see below MPC, Ministry of Fertilizer, so once again, I think that's in line with the Minister of Petroleum's mentioning earlier when we was discussing kind of the strengths in terms of a strategic objective of the Egyptian government is to increase its petrochemical industry, and we're seeing that play out in some of the companies that make a feature on the largest companies in the public markets of Egypt. The growth of the private markets is largely based on the introduction of new institutional investors participating in the space. So as recently as 2019, for more than 40% of funded Egyptian startups, the only source of funding was a relatively small amount that was raised from participating in accelerators. In 2021, while those accelerators remained very active, there was an introduction of both local and international venture capitalists participating in rounds and providing larger ticket sizes and check sizes for these Egyptian startups. So this resulted, if we look, in an increased average raise per startup up to 3.8 million in 2021 from 1.724 million in 2020 and 972,000.8 US dollars in 2019. This is all in US dollars, by the way. So we've seen kind of like how this introduction of more institutional VCs have provided kind of the Egyptian startup with more adequate and robust funding. If we're looking at some of the standouts also from this Egyptian private market space, I think it's important to look at and raise that in 2021, there were 43 rounds that were worth more than $1 million US dollars, with the standout investments being MNT Halan, which raised $120 million US dollars, the retail tech platform Max AV, which raised $55 million, logistics startup Trellar, which raised $42 million US dollars, retail tech company Capital, which raised $33 million, e-commerce platforms Breadfast, which raised $26 million, and HomeSmart, which raised $15 million US dollars, as well as internet company Paymob, which raised $15 million US dollars. And it's also important to mention that one of the things that we've seen in kind of like other kind of African destinations that have received private market investment has been kind of like just largely skewed by fintech. I think from Egypt, it's quite well balanced across different arenas and different industries. So just to put this on the screen, this is the total Egyptian startup funding by sector. So, and we're seeing that it's 36.4%, the total startup funding went to fintech, with 36.3% going to e-commerce, and then it largely kind of like scaled it down to 15.2% representing logistics, and then e-health and edtech performing in terms of 3.1%, 2.1% for edtech and 3.1% for e-health, and then 6.9% to other. So we're seeing that there's a really balanced kind of like investment landscape taking place from a private markets perspective in Egypt, both amongst kind of fintech and obviously in the e-commerce space as well. The stages of Egyptian funding rounds, I think in a similar story that we saw with Nigeria, I think there's plenty of room for Egypt to grow. So of the 117 different individual rounds that were raised by Egyptian startups over the course of the year, in 2021, 71 or 60.7 of them made public, what stage of funding it was at. So looking at that kind of sample size, we see that obviously from a pre-seed perspective, 23 or 32.4 44% of Egyptian funding rounds, and seed was 29 startups, which makes up 40.8, were by far the majority, so accounting for a combined 73.2% of rounds, with just 8 Series A and 2 Series B rounds, plus 1 pre-Series C. So obviously, it's also important to say that obviously kind of like looking at the kind of like timing perspective, Egyptian startups were clearly at an earlier stage than their counterparts, let's say in Nigeria. So further increases in investment can be forecast as these companies advance along their funding life cycles or fundraising life cycles. Only 2 startups raised any form of debt capital, an average of 1.7%, which is also significantly well below the continental average. I think it's important to mention with relative youth of funded Egyptian ventures is important because 60% of the 115 startups were founded in the last 3 years. So obviously there's kind of definitely been a boom in terms of the private market space. So that's definitely kind of like a positive as well. And we hope that kind of like looking at future rounds, they continue to grow, continue to kind of find product market fit, continue to attract institutional investors, both local and international. Looking from a future perspective, or let's say taking a kind of like an outlook on Egypt's economy going forward, I think there's a lot of things to be positive about. I think the first thing is that potentially, as we see a potential winding down of the Russia-Ukraine war, we can kind of get back to, or Egypt can get back to their kind of like potential revenues from tourism, and also kind of like their improve their food security as they kind of like bought a lot of wheat from both Russia and Ukraine. So that's the first thing. And then I think another point that would be super helpful is as the Egyptian startup ecosystem continues to mature, it continues to kind of like raise further rounds, it also incentivizes and provides kind of like an attractive offer for potential entrepreneurs in Egypt to participate in the private markets, raise fundraising from both local and international investors, and continue to grow that ecosystem. So we'll see kind of like we expect growth to snowball as more ventures start to raise larger, later stage rounds, and the interest of international investors in joining what is already kind of a strong local VC ecosystem continues to grow. Just kind of like continuing on that trend of international investment or FDI, the pushing for international investment also continues from kind of like a more kind of strategic and more kind of administrative perspective. And we see this in terms of Egypt using this as an important tool to push growth. So the General Authority for Investment in Free Zones, or GAFI as they are kind of acronized, has stated that Egypt is ranked first in Africa for foreign direct investment, or in 2020 second in the Arab world, behind the United Arab Emirates in terms of an attractive place for investors, international investors, to kind of invest their money. And GAFI have also made a strategic effort to kind of like target particular sectors that they want to grow. These are agriculture, construction and building, transport and logistics, communications and information, healthcare, and tourism. So kind of like a very wide approach, but very strategic in terms of each of those. And just to finish off, regional investment is on the rise. So Saudi Arabia announced in March last year that it would purchase $10 billion in state assets from Egypt, and in June confirmed its intention to lead, so kind of like doubling down with $30 billion worth of investments into Egypt. And several Saudi companies have signed agreements last year to invest roughly around $7.7 billion in fields varying from renewables to pharmaceuticals. And strong kind of like localized investment landscape taking place, also kind of providing an attractive offering for international investors. So it's a perfect combination that's taking place in Egypt. And on the basis of that, I expect them to continue doing well, continue growing and providing kind of like a strong case for one of the leaders in terms of the African continent in terms of startup funding. So that is Egypt done. If you like this video, feel free to share with a friend, like, comment, subscribe, do all of that good stuff. I also have a newsletter where I provide my weekly thoughts, and I'm going to provide a link kind of below for you or for your reference. If you're interested, check it out. Talk about art, culture, finance, tech, all of those good stuff. And on that note, join us next week where we will be discussing the 4th edition of the Big Four series, which is South Africa. And until then, peace.